Okay, thanks very much. Well, good afternoon, everybody, and good morning to I know at least one of our presenters and one of our attendees. My name is Andrew Futter, and I'm for those of you that don't know me, I'm Professor of International Politics here at Leicester, where I'm also leading the third nuclear age research project, of which this is kind of an outcrop, although by no means one of my ideas. It's one of my excellent team, or two people in my excellent team that have put it together. Before we start today, just two quick bits of house rules. So please could I ask everybody in the audience to turn off their microphones, if that's possible. You'll get a chance to speak a bit later on, and also to turn off videos unless you're one of the panelists. Again, we can come back to that a little bit later on, and you will get a chance to ask questions and get involved, but I'll come back to this once the presentations have finished. The second thing to note is that the event is being recorded. It's not live, but it's being recorded, and I think the intention is to share this publicly afterwards. So please treat this as a public meeting. I'm delighted to have the honour of chairing this third nuclear age research project today, Nuking the site from orbit, which Bleddyn had to explain the significance of to me, which probably shows me how ill-equipped I am to do this, but I'm sure he'll tell you about it in a minute. But we wanted to put this, or Bleddyn and Cameron wanted to put this event together today to look into the recent activities in China, but particularly this fractional orbital bombardment system tests, or FOBS, as it's become known. But also to publicise their excellent recent research paper on this topic, which was published by the Asia Pacific Leadership Network a few weeks ago. We've included a link to their paper in the chat, and I'm sure we can circulate that in other ways afterwards if people would like it. And we've also put the link to the Secure World Foundation's Global Counter Space Capabilities document as well, which I understand is an absolute go-to. So please do check both of those things out. So the plan today is for me not to say very much at all, which I'm sure you'll all be relieved about, those of you that have come to previous meetings. But just to before we hand over to our distinguished guests and panelists, I just wanted to quickly introduce them. So I'm not sure if everyone is in the same order on the screens at home, but if you just wave when I say your name, we have Damale, who's a senior researcher at the Verification Research Training and Information Centre in London. Victoria Samson, who's the director of the Washington office for the Secure World Foundation, who joins us today from the United States. Dr. Cameron Hunter, who's a research associate in nuclear politics here at Leicester, and Dr. Bowen, who's a lecturer in international politics, also here at Leicester. Each of the panelists is going to have approximately 5 minutes in which to make some of their remarks, after which there'll be time for Q&A and discussion, and particularly if people want things clarified as well. I think this can be quite a complex topic, and the idea today is to get everybody to understand what's going on and the importance and what's happening at the moment. So with that, I'll mute myself and hand over to you, Bleddyn.
Thanks very much, Andrew. Right, I'm going to start by sharing one image, which I hope that you can all see now. Can you see that, Andrew? Yes, okay, excellent, thank you. So what I'm going to be going through in the next 5 minutes is hopefully to try and explain what we think China may have tested or not, and as a basis for the rest of the conversation that will follow. So at the very start here, it's important to know that we have very little concrete information to act on or to read about when it comes to understanding what exactly did China test fly back in July and or August earlier this year. There's uncertainty as to how many flights were conducted, which shows the level of the lack of information that we are operating with. But the thing that it seems like has been tested based on the little information that has been released via anonymous sources from the Pentagon to the Financial Times here in the UK, and also based on a lot of open source analysts who work on missile and space and non-proliferation, is what we call a fractional orbital bombardment system. And what that is really is a way of launching nuclear weapons that go into an orbital flight path and then come back down into the atmosphere before reaching their target. So on that diagram there, that is the dark blue pathway that you can see, or trajectory, that goes around the planet in a nice sort of circularish line. I know there's a few space physics experts in the audience, and they'll probably freak out that I'm saying circular rather than elliptical, but we'll park that for the moment. This is contrasted with a ballistic missile, which is like that light blue that you can see, which hops above the atmosphere and comes back down in a ballistic trajectory. It basically coasts after being boosted into space and comes back down. This is also contrasted with a hypersonic glider, which is in red, which goes up on a rocket booster and then comes back down straight away at the higher reaches of the atmosphere, traveling at very high speeds as well, as fast, or not as fast, I should say, as a ballistic missile, but still at Mach 5 or possibly greater. Now, what it sounds like China has tested is some Frankenstein's monster, possibly, of a FOBS vehicle that goes into an orbital flight path and then jettisons a hypersonic glide vehicle that could carry bombs, conventional or nuclear bombs on them. So it would go into orbit, and then a vehicle would then re-enter the atmosphere and not fall according to gravitational physics, but would actually glide at hypersonic speeds and fly around like in the red pathway there. So it's a hybrid of a hypersonic glider and fractional orbital bombardment. And what this system really means is that you go the long way around to hitting a target rather than the shortest or the most efficient way of doing it. And the Soviet Union developed a FOBS system, or fractional orbital bombardment system, back in the 1960s and the 1970s. They developed it to try and circumvent US early warning radars, which are designed to detect nuclear warheads that were incoming to the United States across the North Pole. A fractional orbital bombardment system can go the long way around the planet before re-entering the atmosphere. Now, this capability, for me, doesn't really change much in terms of the nuclear balance between China and the United States, especially when you consider why the Soviet Union gave up on the fractional orbital bombardment system. When the United States developed its first early warning infrared satellites, which could detect the heat exhausts of satellites or rockets being launched, it meant that any form of surprise attack from the southern direction of the United States was no longer particularly feasible. And also when the Soviet Union had an assured second strike capability with ICBMs, or intercontinental ballistic missiles, or submarine-launched ballistic missiles, SSBNs, that could wipe out the United States regardless of who struck first in a conflict. In the context of all that and that nuclear balance, of mutually assured destruction, throwing things around the planet the long way around, doesn't really change the fact that both sides could destroy each other with nuclear weapons. So it was very expensive and also quite temperamental, and also didn't really fit a lot of the more idealistic narratives that the superpowers like to have about space at the time. So in that sense, not a lot has changed today. With China, as we know, they are enhancing and building more ICBMs especially in the western deserts of China. And they are also increasing their submarine-launched ballistic missiles as well. So I wouldn't be surprised if this is something where China's tested it just to see that they can do it, but it may not be something that they will roll out on a large scale because of existing nuclear modernization and expansion that's going on. I think that's 5 minutes, Andrew, I think. So I will stop that there, but hopefully that's given you as good an introduction as possible, and I was able to hopefully show you that FOBS is not the only way to be sure of nuking another country. So there are other better existing ways of doing so. Thank you.
Excellent. Thank you very much, Bleddyn. I wasn't counting, but that did look about 5 minutes. So that's brilliant. I think that's great just to set us up with some of the basics. Is probably not really the right word, but some of the sort of the framework around which this discussion will revolve. So thanks for that. And Victoria, I'll hand over to you.
Great, thank you. Thank you for having me. As was said, my name is Victoria Samson. I'm with the Secure World Foundation. The Secure World Foundation is a private organization that focuses on the long-term sustainable use of space. We push for best practices and norms of behavior to make sure that space is accessible to and usable for all over the long term. As was mentioned, I'm the co-editor of our Global Counter Space Threat Assessment, which is open source, i.e. unclassified. It's available on our website. A lot of what I'll be talking about specifically regarding China's counter space capabilities comes from that. It's available also, we have the executive summary translated into French, Spanish, Mandarin, and Russian. So I'll be talking a little bit to kind of contextualize really quickly why the United States appears to be very concerned about China's reports of this FOBS, and we can go into a lot of discussion later on about whether or not they're over threatened. But just generally speaking, China there's strong evidence that China has a sustained effort to develop counter space capabilities. They've conducted multiple tests of rendezvous and proximity operations in both low Earth orbit and geosynchronous orbit that could lead to a co-orbital anti-satellite capability. As of yet, there's no proof that they've actually conducted an actual destructive co-orbital intercept, and there's no proof that these technologies are being developed for anything other than intelligence gathering purposes. China has at least one and possibly three programs underway to develop direct descent anti-satellite capabilities. And when I say direct descent, I mean basically a ground-launched interceptor that hits a target in space. And so these capabilities can be either developed as a dedicated counter space capability or perhaps a mid-course missile defense system. China's engaged in multiple progressive tests of these capabilities since 2005, indicating a serious and sustained organizational effort. Although official Chinese statements on space and warfare has been consistently aligned with the peaceful purposes of outer space, privately they've become more nuanced. China has recently designated space as a military domain, and military writings state that the goal of space warfare and operations is to achieve space superiority using offensive and defensive means. In 2015, China reorganized its space and counter space forces and placed them in a new force structure that has control also over electronic warfare and cyber. That said, it is uncertain whether China would fully utilize its offensive counter space capabilities in a future conflict, or whether the goal is to use them as a deterrent against US aggression. There is no public evidence of China actively using counter space capabilities in current military operations. So that's kind of the counter space aspect of it. China has developed a hypersonic glide vehicle known as a DF-ZF, has tested it at least 9 times since 2014. US defense officials have stated that this may be capable, and again, there's a lot of nuance here, may be capable of extreme maneuvers during flight. Unclassified reports indicate it might be equipped with conventional warheads and could possibly travel to ranges of 2,500 kilometers. China is also developing the DF-41 long-range intercontinental ballistic missile, which has been, US officials have seemed to imply it could carry a nuclear-capable HGV. Bleddyn went into earlier the FOBS, so I won't go into that as well. But in the few minutes I have left, I'd like to talk about it from the US side. Hypersonic glide vehicles, their trajectory and maneuverability are complicated to detect, to track, and to defend against an attack. Although an HGV launched by a rocket booster would reach a target more quickly than it would be by an aircraft or a cruise missile, as Bleddyn said, it's not faster than a ballistic missile. Again, though, it's more difficult to predict the intended target and direct missile defense interceptors towards the hypersonic glide vehicle. I will say the US doesn't really have a good way to defend against these sort of things. Of course, we don't have a good way, frankly, proven to defend against ballistic missile defense. But I will point out that the agency charged with this in the United States military, the Missile Defense Agency, actually used to be called the Ballistic Missile Defense Organization. They were very clear, we don't do cruise missiles, we don't do HEVs, we don't do that sort of thing. We're ballistic. And then they changed it a few years ago, and then a couple of years ago, they said, okay, maybe we need to start looking at other aspects of it. The US itself has been working on developing hypersonic glide vehicles. We first started looking at them almost 20 years ago. We were looking more, the United States was looking more at long range, deep penetration, targets. And now there's more of an interest in getting more regional intermediate range targets. The Navy, the Air Force, the Army, and DARPA all have hypersonic weapons programs. And then just really quickly, because I know I'm on time, the U.S. is looking at, in the past couple of years when the U.S. talked about developing its hypersonic glide vehicles, it'd say, okay, we're going to develop sensors, space-based sensors that can detect and track these missiles in flight. And both the Space Development Agency and the Missile Defense Agency have been working on developing those capabilities. But within the past year or so, there's been more interest in developing an interceptor. And in fact, just last week, the Missile Defense Agency announced that it released a contract to 3 defense contractors to develop some sort of interceptor to hit hypersonic glide vehicles. So with that, I know I'm on time, but I'd just like to point out, looking at hypersonic weapons development, hypersonic weapons defense, there's a lot of questions about the affordability, about the technical feasibility, and the utility of even doing so. There's questions about whether the U.S. command and control architecture can process data quickly enough in order to make these sort of decisions. And then, as always, when you talk about military organizations, there's a division of labor. You have the SDA, you have the MDA. Are they coordinating things properly? Are they double dipping? Are they, leaving a gap? So there's a lot of things to sort out in this. And with that, I know I'm on time. I'll stop and look forward to your questions. Thank you.
Excellent. Thanks so much, Victoria. I think it's really useful to get that US perspective and think about the other side of this as well, the response and what it might look like, and probably something we'll come back to about how these things have been around for a long time, both offensive and defensive guises. Next, I'll pass over to Cameron, who comes to us live from the very swanky Third Nuclear Age team office in the Attenborough Tower. I just hope no one comes in the door.
All right, thanks so much. And yeah, thanks to Victoria, especially for those comments just before, because hopefully my comments on Chinese historical views of what fractional orbital bombardment systems might be for, hopefully should dovetail onto that quite nicely. So you set me up really well. So I guess in my 5 minutes, I'm just going to very quickly try and answer the question of, is China right to fear, correct to fear, shall we say, US ballistic missile defenses? Caveated, of course, with if indeed this is the motivation for pursuing a fractional orbital bombardment system, if indeed this is, in fact, FOBS at all, we don't really know. So caveats aside, and I'm going to run you through just why that might be the case. But then overall, what I'm suggesting is that if this is indeed the motivation for Chinese decision makers, they are mistaken in this assessment. So why should China fear US ballistic missile defenses? We know that in the 1960s and 1970s, Chinese leaders were scared that US ballistic missile defenses, which were actually in development at the time, were intended almost solely for use to nullify a Chinese nuclear attack in the event of a war or a crisis between the US and China in the 1960s and 70s. And this was a publicly declared purpose for a system. So the US had been developing the Nike system in the early and mid 1960s. This looked like it was going to be too expensive to really be of much use against the Soviet Union. And the Secretary of Defense at the time is on the record in a private conversation as being asked, what are you going to do? Because the system is not really, it's not really fit for purpose. And he said, China bomb. We're going to reorientate this thing to be about the Chinese nuclear weapons arsenal. And that was particularly pertinent after 1967, when the Chinese demonstrated a hydrogen bomb capability, a much more powerful nuclear bomb. However, at the time, China didn't have an ability to launch a nuclear weapon that could hit the continental United States. As a response, it seems that Zhou Enlai, the Chinese premier at the time, had suggested that there should be directed for a feasibility study into a Chinese fractional orbital bombardment system, in part because the Soviets had been looking at one. But this was really stepped up after 1970, after the Americans had made this announcement that what had been the Nike system was now the Sentinel system, and the Sentinel system was for countering Chinese nuclear weapons. As many of you probably know, US-China diplomatic relations improved enormously after 1972 with the signing of the Shanghai Communique between President Nixon's presidential administration and the Chinese government. So by 1973, as Bleddyn said, fractional orbital bombardment systems are rather sort of fussy, difficult to do sort of systems. Relations with the United States was looking a lot better. So in 1973, that first Chinese fractional orbital bombardment system program was actually cancelled. In the 1980s, the Americans famously pursued their Star Wars, so-called space-based interceptor program, and we have evidence in the American archives of China raising diplomatic concerns, mostly privately with the American government, but those concerns were dismissed by American officials at the time, because at that time the Chinese nuclear arsenal was still very, very small, and they only had really a few dozen missiles that could actually hit the United States. And to the present day, unfortunately, there are US officials that will paint this picture that the US is not really truly vulnerable to Chinese nuclear weapons, which, as we get into the questions, maybe we'll explore more, but there's reasons to doubt that. And of course, in international relations, perceptions matter a lot. So perhaps these comments are being taken a bit too literally in Beijing. So why is an assessment that China should be worried about US ballistic missile defense actually not the right thing to do? It's a simple numbers game. We're looking at really only around about 60 or so Chinese missiles that could hit the continental United States if there was a nuclear crisis today. There are around 40 or so interceptors available on the American side to intercept these missiles. So already you're seeing a disparity, and each interceptor is highly, highly unlikely to actually knock out an incoming Chinese warhead on its own. It might take as many as 4 tasked against each bomb coming in. It doesn't take very many bombs to make it through the shield before the United States is having one of the worst days in its history, if not the worst day in history. And of course, the US can very much do that to China as well. So this is why Bleddyn was indicating at the start of the session that really this situation of mutually assured destruction, if not total, but certainly extremely terrible levels of nuclear destruction that both sides can wage on each other. Unfortunately, there are alarmist Chinese analysts, both official and semi-official, that for really, as we've seen for decades, back to the 1980s, back to the 1960s, and in the 21st century as well, that are consistently assessing, well, the American system doesn't work now, but maybe it will work next year, maybe it will work in 5 years, maybe it will work in 15 years. And so to what extent these analysts are being listened to with their alarmist and I would say strategically misleading assessments, we don't know how much those misleading assessments are feeding decision-making in Beijing. And of course, the fact that the two countries will not talk to each other in many of these space and nuclear issues, and they're not putting the blame solely on the US there. The Chinese government has said that until there's strategic parity, they're not interested in talking to the United States on nuclear issues. There's no dialogue on this, and so unfortunately, the trend doesn't look particularly good for future US-China strategic affairs. And I'll leave it there, and I look forward to the rest of the panel and the questions. Thank you.
Well, thanks, Cameron. I think, given just having a quick look through the people that we've got in the meeting, I think there'll be a lot of participants really interested in that Chinese perspective as well that you're able to give. So hopefully we'll get some questions on that bit too. And then last but not least, Anu.
Hi, thank you, everyone. I've been very generously introduced as a senior researcher. I am but a researcher, but thank you for having me regardless. So I'm going to do the Gen Z / millennial thing of, well, why should we care? You know, those like Instagram posts that people reel through. Well, you know, why should we care? The technology is what the technology is, and it will do what it does. So why should we care how it's presented? Well, we should care because words matter. And the way that we describe technologies impact the power that those technologies have outside of the actual use of the technology. So I'm going to go at this from a lens of something called responsibility. Now, you can define that in any way you want, but the way that we're going to go down this route is the latest UK resolution at the UN. And essentially, the UK has gone to the UN and said, we want to work on an open-ended working group which discusses how we can reduce threats in space and promote certain norms by discussing responsible behaviours. And this test happened around before or the knowledge of the test came out just before the open-ended working group became a publicly known thing. There's also something called the Outer Space Treaty, which I'm sure everyone on this call knows about, but there are particular things to do with registration and declaring when you're doing something in the treaty that haven't really been considered, even if this test wasn't nuclear armed. It's still taking place in space. It is still something that is going into space. And so knowledge about what it is, when it's going up there, and why it's going up there is required under the registration convention, according to a lot of experts. Now, I know that the test wasn't nuclear armed, so, you know, it didn't actually have nukes there, which means that the Outer Space Treaty is a bit, you know, muddled when it comes to actually putting nukes into space. But there are going to be stopping points for this technology to actually come through and actually deploy nuclear weapons in space. The first is you're not meant to put nukes in space, full stop. The second is there's this thing called safeguards on the nuclear side, where you have to actually track where and what nuclear material is doing for a state. And most states that are interested in this technology or have demonstrated capacity with this technology are party to safeguards and something called the additional protocol. So there are legal blocks and also technical blocks. You know, all of the speakers before have talked about how the system isn't perfect. There is always this imbalance where someone is playing catch up, there's someone doing an attack, someone is playing defense, and that defense will keep catching up. And so wasting time, as it were, on a technology that essentially does the same thing. If you're going to nuke a country, you're going to nuke that country. So this technology isn't really doing something new. And so use of the words like space weapon, space race, arms race, but in space is really dangerous. And the reason is that because space isn't the weapon, space is the domain within which these technologies are being applied. And these technologies are applied on Earth as well. It's not that they change. Yes, their nature changed slightly and their impacts change slightly when they're in space. But we do need to talk about how language, and especially language used by people in great power governments, can influence how the technology is perceived and how the domain is constructed. And by constructed, I mean regulated, thought of, and perceived by the public. And this idea of construction, kind of social construction or political construction of a domain, is more important, I think, than we let on. And then finally, one of the bits that I wanted to pull out that I think is really interesting is how this conversation, whenever China does something, always comes down to US and China. I understand that they are two actors with a lot of political power, but there are regional actors within Asia and within the East who are becoming more and more capable when it comes to space. India, for instance, is one of the only countries that, whether this is a good thing or not, personally don't think it's a good thing, but has demonstrated something called anti-satellite capability. And this is something that I'm sure will come up in the Q&A, but Russia's test did the same thing. And so there are regional actors such as India, such as South Korea, and I think Bleddyn and Cameron's report touches on this, that actually need to decide to take that platform and rather than waiting for the US and China to sort of push each other into shape, say, you know what, we actually have a stake in this, and get other regional powers or even P5, permanent members of the Security Council, to champion those countries into becoming pioneering actors in the agenda setting when it comes to the applications of technology in space, but also what responsibility means to them and how countries such as China or Russia behave has an impact on them. I'm going to leave it there because I think that the Q&A will be a better way to discuss this, but I hope that was helpful. And thank you for having me again.
Wonderful. Well, pleasure to have you with us, Anu, and thanks very much for that. I think this issue of, well, what's actually new and why we hype it so much and why we focus just on the US and China, I think all of those are really quite fascinating, and that's kind of quite an interesting story within that. We've got about half an hour, I think. The way to do this, I mean, I've got a few questions which I'll kick us off with